Today, we are going to have some story from Reddit. But before we start, don't forget to subscribe, like the video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment down below. These simple clips mean a lot to the future of this channel.
The lengthy journey from Singapore to Chicago's O'Hare Airport, including a layover in Taipei, didn't trouble me significantly, even though it took nearly a full day. The fact that I was traveling in business class on my birthday made it more bearable. I wasn't particularly concerned about the challenging discussion awaiting me with our company's international stock and share trading department chief in Chicago. However, my thoughts were preoccupied with the situation unfolding at home, which was causing me considerable worry. After landing at 8:30, I checked into the Chicago Sheraton Suites, showered, hit the gym, then took another shower, alternating between hot and cold water to wake myself up. I went down for a hearty American breakfast, which I had missed over the last 4 months, and drank 4 cups of coffee. Then I headed to my 10:30 meeting at JP Morgan. Upon arrival, I was escorted to a small conference room, and it was clear they were playing hardball. The room had 2 cameras, likely watching me. I stood by the window without moving for over 17 minutes, counting in my head. I had learned to show no fear or weakness, a lesson from my many trips to the Far East and Southeast Asia. Joe Rutledge, Vice President of International Stock and Commodities Traders, entered the room with Samuel Young, our corporate lawyer. The atmosphere shifted. This was a serious meeting. If it had been just Joe, we would have brainstormed solutions. If it had been only Samuel, the focus would have been on legal protection for the bank. But with both present, it was clear someone was about to be fired. Me. Joe gestured for me to sit and took a seat opposite me, indicating the tension that lay ahead. He demanded to know what had happened in Singapore. I acknowledged my role in approving a $300 million stock buy for a newly listed company, despite its lack of a proven track record. I defended my decision, citing the strong prospectus and the expertise of the management team, which collectively had nearly 200 years of experience. I highlighted the project's technological soundness and backing by reputable firms. However, Joe was irate about the company's declining stock price, which had fallen from $17 to $9.55 since listing. Despite the situation, I remained optimistic, explaining our strategy to buy more shares, anticipating a rebound that could yield substantial profits. I noted that we were the largest shareholder, holding 25% of the stock. Joe's frustration escalated as he argued that the company was tanking, fueled by short-selling competitors from China and Southeast Asia, aiming to undermine our position in the market. I reiterated the need to stay the course, but Joe dismissed my report as wishful thinking, informing me that the board had backed his recommendation. I was out. Samuel briefed me on the severance package, 3 months' salary, and nearly 30 days of accrued leave, totaling around $800,000. However, my reputation was in shambles, and my job prospects were bleak. By 2 p.m., I had signed the necessary forms, converted my 401k to an IRA, and returned my company materials, including my laptop. I stepped outside, feeling hollow, and rushed to catch a cab, battling thoughts of failing on the street. Back at the hotel, I poured a mini whiskey with 7-Up over ice, an indulgence, but I needed it. I pondered my situation. At 42, I felt too young to retire, yet uncertain about starting over. I realized I needed to take a chance. I bought a new laptop with Windows 11 and set up programs to track my trades. I accessed my savings account, which had $50,000, and my investment accounts had $250,000, but required a 24-hour notice for withdrawal. After selling some blue-chip shares, I estimated that with my severance, I would have over $1.2 million, which I planned to transfer to an offshore trading account, Blue Sky International. By the time I finished, it was after 9 p.m. I ordered a burger and beer from room service and hesitated to turn on my phone, which had been off for over 36 hours. I was too mentally drained to face any messages, so I lay on the bed, channel surfing for news on the markets, but found nothing of interest. Whiskey, beer, burger, jet lag hit, and I passed out. The next morning, still adjusting, I went for an early breakfast and checked my phone. It was flooded with messages. "Help, Dad, Mom's having a meltdown," from Dean and Katie. "What's going on with Jean?" from my father. "Happy birthday, why aren't you answering?" from Jean's parents. Birthday wishes from the kids, my dad, my sister Georgia, and the Singapore team. Dean also left voicemails about Jean crying but calming down. Jean herself didn't send any messages. No birthday wishes, no explanations. I flew to Springfield, Ubered home, and found chaos, mess everywhere, unwashed dishes, a full trash bin, and a laundry pile-up. I cleaned the house and tackled the bedrooms, replacing sheets and organizing. It took 3 hours to get things under control. Finally, I checked my laptop. Southeast Asia Aquaculture, SEA, had dropped to $9.37. I was waiting for my funds to clear so I could invest. I called my dad. He said Jean had seemed sad and heartbroken for 2 weeks, but there was no clear reason. I checked our banking transactions. Nothing unusual. Same with the home phone messages. After folding laundry, I decided to cook. I reconnected the battery to my Audi, hit the store, and grabbed groceries for a Thai green curry with jasmine rice. I garnished the dish with spring onions, fresh herbs, and set the table, pouring myself a beer. Halfway through my drink, Jean's car pulled up. The kids ran in, excited to see me. I hugged them, kissed them, and told them how much I missed them. Katie sobbed in my arms, shaking, while Dean kept it together, trying to act more grown up. We stayed in that moment for a while until I noticed Jean watching us with a wistful expression, tears in her eyes. She moved in and kissed me gently, saying, "Welcome home, Adam." Her tone lacked enthusiasm, reflecting a sadness I couldn't ignore. The kids clung to me, and I shared that I was making Thai green curry. Dean expressed curiosity while Katie hugged me tightly. Jean instructed them to clean up and get ready for supper, then gave me a gentle hug, remarking that I looked wiped out and asking why I was back early. I revealed that I had been fired, and she reacted with shock, struggling to find the right words. We briefly discussed work, and she mentioned changes at her job, but I sensed there was more beneath the surface. Just then, the kids came running down, eager to be with me again. At the dinner table, I served the meal, pouring a cool California White for Jean and myself, while Dean opted for Mountain Dew, and Katie chose water. For the first time in 4 months, we sat down together as a family. I shared stories about my time in Singapore, recounting the fun team-building activities like dragon boat races and combat archery, which brought smiles to the kids' faces. After finishing dinner, Dean and Katie returned with a wrapped present, excitedly wishing me a happy birthday. Jean's expression changed to shock as she realized she had forgotten. I was tempted to remind her of the gold and diamond earrings I had given her, but I focused on the kids instead. Inside the box was a DVD collection of Band of Brothers, a show I loved. I kissed my children, sharing in the joy of the moment. Jean, embarrassed, promised to get me a present the next day, but I waved it off, saying being home with my family was enough. Dean and Katie hugged me, expressing their love. We spent over an hour chatting before the kids went to do their homework, and Jean and I started cleaning up. I noticed something was off with her and asked what was going on. She admitted feeling depressed, stating that my frequent absences had made her feel lost and disconnected from our life together. I pulled her into a hug, and she initially resisted, but then let me hold her as she cried softly against my chest. I wanted to comfort her more, but she seemed to need just the embrace. I reflected on the past 6 years of my management role, where I had become a troubleshooter for young teams. We had agreed to make sacrifices for a future of leisure and travel once I turned 50, but it felt like we were losing touch in the meantime. Jean gently disengaged from our embrace and suggested I spend time with the kids. I started with Katie, reviewing her homework before putting her to bed with a kiss. When I went to Dean, he expressed concern about Jean, noting she had been crying and forgetting things, including my birthday. Tears welled in his eyes as he asked me to fix it, leaving me nodding uncertainly, unsure of how to help. As I headed downstairs, I heard Jean talking softly on the phone. She hung up as I entered the room, claiming it was just a colleague from the office. We exchanged glances, but she remained guarded, revealing nothing about what troubled her. I sensed a deeper issue and felt the jet lag creeping back, but there was still much to do. By 9:30, I checked the Singapore Stock Exchange. CA was trading at $9.90, showing some recovery. Afterward, I waited for John to finish in the bathroom. She entered wearing an oversized t-shirt, and after brushing my teeth and rinsing, I climbed into bed. When I reached for her, she initially stiffened, but then curled into me, whispering for me to hold her. As I held her, I felt something was deeply wrong. Had my absence been too much for her? I worried she might have fallen out of love, or worse, that she was hiding an illness. My mind raced with unanswerable questions until exhaustion from the jet lag took over, leading me into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of chasing a nameless shadow. I woke up at 4:30 still feeling tired, so I went for a run and decided to get melatonin to adjust to Central Time. After running for an hour, I returned to find Jean gone, leaving a note asking me to give the kids breakfast and take them to school. I checked my bank account, saw the money from JP Morgan had cleared, and transferred it offshore. CA shares were down to $8.99, not free-falling, but steadily declining. I felt torn between fixing my marriage or my finances. I spent time with Dean and Katie, asking about what they'd been doing. They mentioned activities with Mom's boss, Anthony Miller, and his daughter, Evelyn. Dean quickly assured me Evelyn was always present. I smiled, telling them we'd go on vacation now that I was back. After dropping them at school, I called a few friends and then phoned George Tallis, my old mentor. We discussed my credentials and the CA prospectus, agreeing to meet later. On my way to my first meeting, I picked up melatonin from the pharmacy when I saw Jean and Evelyn Miller leaving St. John's Hospital, looking devastated, clinging to each other. They seemed deeply connected by sorrow, but not physically ill. I wondered if it was a shared lover or something more than just a friendship, leaving me questioning what was really going on. Whatever the situation was, they clearly shared a deep connection. I couldn't quite figure it out, but pushed those thoughts aside to focus on my meetings. I pitched the CA shares and didn't hold back, even mentioning my firing. Julian Knowles said he'd consult with his investment club, while Aaron Goldstein, a wealthy retailer, immediately liked the idea and agreed to invest $10 million once the paperwork was sorted. Later, George called, saying his group of investors was interested. We settled on a commission structure based on returns. I then spoke with my dad, who wanted to invest $100,000 and would transfer the funds the next day. We discussed Jean's strange behavior, and he noted that it seemed like she was mourning. That idea stuck with me as we ended the call. Before hanging up, my dad also recommended a private investigator he'd used before, suggesting I get answers. I spent the rest of the day on calls with contacts in Singapore and Southeast Asia, updating my risk profile on CA. The project was still solid, and the management team had their own money invested, which reassured me. It was a green light, and I was ready to start trading when the market opened. In the meantime, I reached out to the private investigator, Clarence Williams, who my dad recommended. He had a slow southern drawl, but I could tell he was sharp. After asking for a $5,000 advance, he said he'd begin investigating the next day, out of respect for all the business my dad had sent him in the past. With everything set, I paced around, drinking coffee, and trying to burn off my nervous energy. Dean and Katie came home late from sports practice, and I spent some time with them, explaining I had a major deal in the works. Jean arrived looking tired but more purposeful than the night before. She brought Chinese food and handed me a small birthday gift, Hugo Boss aftershave with a generic card that read, "Happy birthday, Adam. Lots of love, Jean." The gesture felt impersonal, like I was just a distant relative. We ate dinner as a family. Dean and Katie chatted about their day, while Jean remained mostly quiet. Dean complained about the local skateboard park closing, and Katie mentioned that Mr. Miller, Jean's boss, was converting a property into a shelter for offended teenagers. Surprised, I turned to Jean for more details. She admitted she had mentioned it, but offered little information, saying Tony wanted to create a legacy project. I pressed her on why this was happening now, sensing she was holding something back. She snapped slightly, saying it was a much-needed cause, but there was more to her reaction than she was letting on. After the kids left the table, I asked again why this was happening now. Jean's face went blank and she gave a vague answer about the opportunity presenting itself. She was clearly hiding something, and while I kept a pleasant expression, it was obvious she wasn't being truthful. There was more to the story, and it felt personal. I helped clean up, took out the garbage, and told Jean I was heading to my study to work. With an hour before trading opened in Singapore, I sat down and reflected on my marriage, trying to stay rational, despite the deep pain threatening to overwhelm me. I wondered how we had ended up here. In the past, Jean and I were compatible in almost every way: where to live, how to spend money, vacations, kids. Even our bed life was good, despite my frequent travels. We usually planned for my return, turning it into a mini honeymoon, but not this time. Clearly, we were no longer on the same page, and it pissed me off. In Singapore, I was constantly hit on, at the office, on the subway, in markets, bars, and clubs. Many of my colleagues engaged with local women, often treating them as live-in maids with benefits, which I found exploitative. I turned down advances 10 times a week because I was married to a woman I loved. Now, Jean's recent behavior made me question if she still felt the same way. I tried to think of any warning signs, but apart from a recent communication breakdown, I couldn't pinpoint anything. There was a lot to process, but for now, I had to focus on my work. When the Singapore market opened, CA was trading at $8.49. I entered cautiously, knowing any large purchase would impact the market. With over $30 million to invest from my contacts in Georgia's, I started with a $5 million buy. This triggered a flood of shares hitting the market, as investors tried to sell and cut losses. I suspected it was my old colleagues, instructed by head office. I continued buying in $5 million increments as the price kept dropping. Short sellers were pushing it down, hoping to buy back cheaper. The price bottomed at $5.61, and I made a final $15 million purchase. We now owned over 10% of the company, enough to get a board seat if we held on. I called George to celebrate, each of us enjoying a drink, me with Canadian whiskey, him with bourbon. By the end of the session, our buying sparked a rally, and the stock climbed to $8.72. Short sellers were in trouble. Exhausted, I went to bed at 2 a.m., forgetting my melatonin. I woke late the next morning, joining the family as they finished breakfast. Jean was on the phone, talking about something urgent. She asked if my trading went well, and I responded vaguely, not revealing that everything but our house was tied up in CA. Jean took the kids to school, and I checked the share price. It had closed at $10.14. The short sellers had lost big, and the stock was stabilizing. I spent the rest of the morning emailing our investors and catching up on business. Then I explored the Miller Real Estate website, which highlighted their New Horizons home program for troubled teens. They claimed to provide housing, meals, and support to help teens get off the streets and back on track. I didn't find much more on the Miller Real Estate website, so I checked Anthony Miller's Facebook. His page was full of vacation photos, cars, and social events. A recent company group photo caught my eye. Anthony was flanked by his daughter Evelyn and Jean. Anthony looked noticeably thinner and older, and Jean was holding his arm, gazing at him instead of the camera. I looked at Jean's Facebook, which had mostly old family pictures, with nothing new of us together in over 2 years. Evelyn's Facebook featured more photos with Jean, but nothing suspicious. Just cryptic posts about the meaning of life and hoping for positive outcomes. I spoke with Clarence Williams again, urging him to fast-track the investigation. He said he'd try, but warned these things take time. I also called my dad, who advised me not to jump to conclusions and to let the experts handle it. I was torn. Should I reach out to Jean to fix things? Or would that make things worse if I found out later I was being deceived? I contacted a lawyer who suggested it's better to fix the marriage than go through a divorce, as no one truly wins in such cases. Finally, I decided to play one last card. I reached out to one of Jean's former colleagues who owed me a favor. He had worked at MRE 6 months ago and agreed to meet me for lunch to share any insights. We met at Red Robin for burgers and a chat. Chad walked in looking like a classic realtor in a company golf shirt, chinos, and Dockers, sunglasses on his head. After some small talk over burgers, I got to the point. He chuckled, realizing I was fishing for information, and asked why. I kept it vague, explaining I had concerns about MRE. He got serious, mentioning that after Tony's wife, Dot, died of cancer, Tony lost his drive for a while. His daughter Evelyn took over, and eventually, Tony regained his focus. Chad then mentioned that Jean and Tony had grown quite close, and she was sometimes referred to as his office wife. He assured me he hadn't seen anything inappropriate, but acknowledged that office gossip can be cruel. Chad also reminded me that I had been away a lot, which could have contributed to their closeness. As he was leaving, Chad casually dropped a bomb. There were rumors that Anthony had been diagnosed with cancer. After he left, I called St. John's Hospital and found out Tony was in a private room in the oncology ward. I paid for lunch and headed home with a lot on my mind. That evening unfolded similarly to the previous ones. After cleaning up, I went outside with a whiskey and cheroot, enjoying the quiet neighborhood. Jean joined me with a glass of wine and confronted me about visiting the MRE website, revealing that they must have tracked visitor data. She questioned why I had been snooping, suggesting I had also checked social media pages. Her tone was accusatory, hinting she was ready for a fight. I kept my poker face, letting her words bounce off. She pressed further, mentioning that Evelyn knew I had accessed her Instagram. Jean was emotional, spilling some wine as she waved off my cheroot smoke. She began crying, but instead of comforting her as I usually would, I remained detached. Her tears seemed more performative than genuine. She insisted I was upsetting her, and when I questioned who she really was, she could only say she was my wife. I doubted her sincerity, leaving her speechless before walking away as she ran inside. I finished my drink and headed to my study. CA shares were rallying and had reached nearly $12, signaling a positive trend. George and I agreed this was not a fluke. As I monitored the market, I noticed some profit taking, though CA was still far from its original listing price. A message from a JP Morgan contact revealed they had managed to offload some stock at a loss, but were holding out for better prices under orders from my old boss, Joe Rutledge. We both laughed at the irony, as it seemed Rutledge might be on the way out while I was proving my worth. That night, I slept on the pull-out bed in my study, avoiding Jean entirely. The next morning, I checked the closing prices on SGX and was pleased to see that CA had climbed to over $13, as predicted. Our investment crowd had doubled their money, and if we could hit the $25 target, we stood to make over 300% profit. I made breakfast, called the kids down, and ignored Jean throughout the morning. After dropping the kids off at school, I went to the gym, had a late breakfast at IHOP, and made some calls before returning home. I spent 2 hours on a virtual meeting with George, discussing the idea of combining our brokerages with offices in Springfield and Chicago. We agreed to move forward with the idea, and I focused on developing a go-to-market plan for the rest of the day. Late in the afternoon, John returned home alone. She told me the kids were spending the night at the Beckers and that we needed to talk. She poured me a bourbon and herself a glass of wine as we sat in the living room. I remained silent, waiting for her to speak first. Eventually, she became agitated and launched into her explanation, saying she didn't know what I thought she'd been doing while I was away, but that my behavior had been disrespectful and cold. She apologized, claiming she felt like we had become strangers due to my time away. She sniffled, saying she had been under a lot of pressure, but insisted that our marriage was all that mattered. After her emotional outburst, she excused herself, and I sat there sipping my drink, wondering if she was losing touch with reality. I heard her on the phone and later the bath running. When she finally came back downstairs, she was dressed in a gray knit dress and black pumps, wearing the pearls I had bought her years ago. She looked stunning for her age, even more attractive than women a decade younger. She urged me to shower and get dressed, saying she'd book a table at Chesapeake Seafood Restaurant. I got ready quickly, ignoring the urge to confront Jean as she seemed to be on the phone again. We Ubered to the restaurant, where she started with a gin and tonic, while I opted for a Singapore gin sling. At dinner, we stuck to casual conversation about the kids and friends, with Jean showing little concern about my job loss. She reassured me, confident that I'd find work soon, unaware that everything depended on my risky bet on CA. The evening continued smoothly as we discussed everyday matters, avoiding any talk about MRE. For mains, I had the captain's platter, and she ordered lobster. She kept the wine flowing, making me wonder if her goal was to get me drunk. Yet, she remained attentive and affectionate, caressing my hand and looking into my eyes. After dinner, she suggested we head to the gin mill to try artisanal gins. The bar was crowded, but we managed to order Negronis. Pressed close, she kissed me passionately, running her tongue across my lips. Soon we left, Jean dragging me out. In the taxi, she kissed me intensely, her hand inside my pants, keeping me hard but stopping short of making me finish. I woke up to the smell of coffee and bacon, put on sweatpants, and went downstairs. Jean was making breakfast and greeted me with a kiss, teasing me about last night's intense act, joking that she should ration me more often. We laughed and shared breakfast while she mentioned chores around the house and yard. Afterward, she left to pick up Dean and Katie. I was in the backyard cleaning up when my phone rang. It was Clarence Williams. "Can you talk?" he asked, and in that moment, everything fell apart. I met Clarence Williams at a downtown coffee shop, expecting someone more like the detectives from TV shows. Instead, he was an unassuming small man, dressed in simple clothes and looking entirely ordinary. His appearance seemed designed to be forgettable, though his strong handshake and high-end phone hinted at more than met the eye. Clarence got straight to the point. He hadn't caught my wife Jean in any overtly incriminating situations. No hotel meetups, secret rendezvous, or physical acts of infidelity. However, he had gathered enough evidence through corroborated testimony to confirm that Jean had been having an affair with her boss, Anthony Miller, for at least 2 years. The affair was apparently common knowledge at the office, with Miller's daughter Evelyn not only aware but actively helping them meet in secret. Clarence detailed how Jean would often spend weekends at Miller's house when I was away, sending the kids to stay with friends. His bluntness hit me hard. It's one thing to suspect infidelity, but hearing it confirmed by someone else felt like a punch to the gut. My body tensed, my hands gripping the table as my mind raced with anger. Every instinct screamed to confront Jean, but I restrained myself. knowing society doesn't condone retaliation, no matter how betrayed I felt. Clarence continued speaking, though I barely heard him over the pounding in my ears. Eventually, he added another blow. Anthony Miller had been diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer and only had a few months left to live. The information hit like a final twist of the knife, leaving me struggling to process it all. Clarence's confirmation matched what Chad had hinted at, but now I knew the affair was not only serious, but terminal due to Anthony's illness. Jean's strange behavior suddenly made sense. She was grieving for the man she truly loved, trying to cope with his approaching death. I explained all of this to Clarence, not because I trusted him as a confidant, but simply because I needed to talk to someone. Clarence's response revealed his insight into these situations. He explained that cheating isn't just about act, but emotional investment. Cheaters often justify their actions by claiming it's more than physical. There are feelings involved. Over time, these relationships develop like any marriage, with shared conversations, private moments, and dreams. They find faults in their spouses to justify their behavior and indulge in the fantasy of a life without the burdens of marriage. This hurt more than imagining them meeting just for act. Jean had given this man her best self, free from the responsibilities and routines of marriage. He offered her only good times, without the everyday struggles that come with raising kids and running a household. It was a relationship built on escape and fantasy, while I was left with the reality of our marriage. After a brief conversation, we agreed to pause the investigation while I processed everything. One thing was clear: my marriage was over. Staying together for the kids was no longer an option. Though the thought of being separated from them was painful, I knew that many children lived in divorced households. My family would now be part of that statistic. I sipped my cooling coffee, feeling the intense pain take over every part of me. I knew I wanted to hurt John and Miller in return, but I had to calm my emotions. Thinking this way wouldn't help. My mind wandered to my time in the Far East, where CEOs approached life and business with long-term strategies, similar to Southern Europeans who wouldn't stop until they destroyed their enemies completely. But I wasn't in the mafia or some triad. I was just an ordinary man living an average life with no special power or influential ally to help me. I realized I was in this alone. I ordered more coffee, contemplating how to exact revenge on a dying man. Jean was easier. I'd take away everything she held dear, though the logistics of that were still forming in my mind. My immediate problem was Miller. He hadn't promised me anything, but he knew Jean was married and disrespected me by pursuing her. My anger flared again. I'd always been a risk-taker, and once I set my mind on something, I was immovable. That stubbornness now drove my desire for revenge, no matter the fallout, even if it crushed me in the process. A plan began to form. I called Clarence and asked him to dig into the troubled women the Millers had helped through their program. It wasn't fully formed yet, just another attempt to find something useful, like casting a wide net. I remembered a lesson from a fishing trip in Kenya. You don't fish for marlin directly. First, you catch smaller fish, then use them as live bait to lure in the bigger catch. On that trip, I successfully caught a marlin, though I felt a deep sadness watching the fish fight for its life. I vowed never to participate in big game fishing again. However, the lesson in catching the marlin inspired a plan. I drove home, practicing breathing exercises to maintain my composure and act as if I was still in the good mood from the previous night's lovemaking. When Jean arrived home later with Dean and Katie, we grilled steaks, corn, and shared a family meal. I played the role of a loving father and husband, masking the inner cynic. While I genuinely enjoyed my time with Dean and Katie, my interactions with Jean felt like a B-grade movie. She was buying into it, seemingly worried I'd put things together, treating me as her fallback plan as her lover was dying. The cynical part of me recognized this dynamic and stored it away for future encounters after the divorce. The following days felt surreal, as I lived out the lie while watching myself act the part I'd chosen. I wondered if actors experienced the same detachment when watching themselves on screen. On a brighter note, George and I finalized our new trading entity in Singapore, transferring the CA stock portfolio. The stock had surged to $16 and climbing, more than doubling our investment. My growing paranoia led me to increase security measures. I added fingerprint access, encrypted files, and wiped my phone, reloading only what I needed. I was becoming more cautious, ensuring nothing could be easily traced or compromised. After that, my focus shifted to exploring potential share listings and reaching out to JP Morgan contacts, laying the groundwork for future business. The non-compete clause wasn't much of a concern since being fired mostly nullified it. On the marriage front, things had quieted while I waited for more evidence, which arrived Thursday on a thumb drive from Clarence. Paranoia made me choose a new coffee shop for the exchange. The drive contained information on 14 women Miller had helped, 5 of whom still lived locally. One had become a full-time escort, indicating Miller's intervention hadn't worked for her. I bought a burner phone and contacted her. She agreed to meet at a motel for $100 an hour, and I had to pay for the room. Layla, a small tattooed woman, arrived on time and quickly offered her services. I stopped her, offering $1,000 for information instead. At first, she hesitated, thinking I was after something inappropriate, but I reassured her I only wanted details about her time at the home for abused women. After some hesitation, Layla eventually opened up. She shared her story. After finishing school, she left home because she couldn't stand her stepdad. Life on the streets quickly spiraled downward, leading her to sell herself just for food and shelter. Drugs soon followed, and she ended up working as a prostitute. One night, a client became violent, beating her when she refused to comply with his demands and dumping her on the street. Bystanders found her and called the police, who took her to the hospital. That's when Mrs. Miller got involved, offering her a place at the shelter after her discharge. Layla stayed at the shelter for about 6 months, but eventually left due to the restrictive rules. As she finished her story, we sat in silence. Her tale, though tragic, was all too common. I wrestled with guilt, wondering if my pursuit of revenge would make me just another offender. But my need for payback overpowered everything else. I asked her if the offense at the home started right away or came later. She hesitated, confused, before realizing what I was getting at. After some thought, she started negotiating, understanding my motives. She asked for $20,000, knowing I wanted to ruin Miller's life for ruining my marriage. Her boldness surprised me, but I saw potential in her plan. She promised to use the Me Too movement to her advantage and expose Miller. We discussed logistics. She wanted the money to start over and leave the life she was trapped in for the sake of her young daughter. I offered to help her secure a legitimate job in Chicago if things worked out, and her cautious hope turned to excitement. We exchanged contact information, and I gave her my burner number under the name Jerry. She offered a quick service given the time left, but I declined. With that, phase 1 was complete. At home, I maintained my internal conflict while outwardly playing the devoted husband, and Jean seemed to believe it. She was too absorbed in Miller's legacy project to notice anything unusual. I positioned myself strategically to gather information on the project's progress without raising her suspicions. We cooked and ate together like we used to, but I saw her differently now. I had closeness with her often, treating her like a means to an end. She might have thought we were making love, but to me, she was no different from Layla. Just more attractive. I took control, not caring about her pleasure. I made her give me BJ every other morning and never returned the favor. I felt justified, considering the cost of the upcoming divorce. And I was getting what I could while I still could. Oddly, instead of being upset, Jean seemed to embrace my new attitude. By Friday, she was giving me morning BJ without prompting. It was clear she was either enjoying the change, accustomed to more closeness from both Miller and me, or trying to solidify her position as my wife before her lover passed. Maybe it was a combination of all three. Over breakfast, John mentioned she'd be busy setting up for the New Horizons home unveiling on Monday. I already knew the details from their website and social media. The mayor was attending along with local media and CBS. She made a comment about Miller being well enough to attend, which stirred something in me. The divorce papers were ready, waiting for my signal to be served. With Illinois being a no-fault state, irreconcilable differences would be the official reason. As I started my day on SGX, I was pleased to see our shares climbing, a small but positive start to Friday. I tuned into WMA for Evelyn's 9:30 interview, where she discussed MRE's social responsibility program and her father's involvement in the New Horizons home project. She spoke warmly about how the program began with her mother and was continued by her father, now expanding into a fully funded community initiative. The host was enthusiastic and callers praised the program, pledging donations. Everything seemed positive until one caller disrupted the narrative. A hesitant voice on the line, breaking with sobs, urged listeners not to believe in the home's success, claiming it had allowed Mr. Miller to exploit the women there. She identified herself as Layla and accused Anthony Miller of ruining her life, leaving her on the streets as a prostitute. Evelyn, shocked and defensive, denied the allegations, insisting her father was a good man. The station quickly went to a break, and when they returned, the host struggled to regain control. Evelyn tried to defend her father, clearly believing in his innocence. Meanwhile, the phone lines lit up with mixed reactions. Some supported Layla, while others doubted her story, calling her a liar. The emotional intensity of the situation had turned what was meant to be a feel-good interview into a public controversy, with listeners passionately debating the truth. The chaos intensified when a woman named Rita called in, claiming Anthony Miller had assaulted her too. This sparked a flood of calls and social media posts, with more women coming forward, some sharing detailed abuse stories. The situation quickly escalated into a viral movement, making it hard to distinguish truth from exaggeration. I reached out to my old friend Vicky, worried about my wife's involvement with MRE. She agreed this could be a massive scandal if true. By lunchtime, radio stations fell silent, but social media erupted. Initially divided, public opinion soon turned against Miller, with countless women sharing their experiences. Feeling overwhelmed, I shut everything off, took Tylenol, and retreated to the shower. The weight of the day broke me down, and I cried harder than I had in years, realizing I had crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Nietzsche's warning about becoming the monster you fight described me perfectly. Miller had wronged me, but in seeking revenge, I had unleashed a storm beyond my control. All I could do was hang on and hope. I picked up Dean and Katie, then made chicken stir-fry for dinner. Jean was absent, her phone off. We waited, ate, and played a board game without her. By 10, she finally came home looking utterly devastated, her makeup smudged, hair disheveled, and the weight of the day's events heavy on her. She collapsed into a chair, shaken by the accusations against Miller. I handed her a drink and calmly pointed out that where there's smoke, there's usually fire. She refused to believe Miller could be guilty, insisting he was a good man. I began phase 2 of my plan. I reminded Jean that, as her husband, we knew everything about each other. But how could she really know Miller? He was just her boss. She clung to her belief in his goodness, but I pushed harder, suggesting there were things she couldn't possibly know about him. Doubt flickered in her expression as I continued to plant seeds of suspicion. Jean gasped in shock, turning pale as she asked if Miller had ever tried anything with me. I denied it, watching as she dissolved into tears, staring into her empty glass. Without finding any answers, she wearily headed upstairs, briefly greeting the kids before disappearing into the shower. Pretending to be half asleep, I listened as she made calls downstairs, first to Evelyn, repeatedly calling the situation a nightmare and questioning why multiple women would accuse Miller. Then she made a call to Tony, assuring him it was a misunderstanding before ending with, "I love you too." By the time she returned to bed, I was genuinely asleep. The next morning, I made breakfast and took Dean and Katie to their practice. Vicky called, informing me that 4 women had come forward, and the mayor's office, along with various civic groups, was distancing themselves from the project. The Attorney General had even announced an investigation. When I returned home, Jean was gone. With the SGX closed, I had little to do. I called George about business and spoke to my dad about my broken marriage. He sadly agreed it was beyond repair, feeling bad for Dean and Katie, but knowing they would join the many kids in the U.S. dealing with separated parents. I called Jean, who was with Evelyn and the company lawyers trying to fight the allegations. I warned her about the potential fallout, but she stayed involved. Despite their efforts, things worsened. That weekend, MRE's busiest days saw a massive drop in visitors, and by Monday, cancellations flooded in. The opening of the New Horizons home was postponed due to the bad press. On Monday, another woman came forward through a newspaper ad, accusing Miller of assault during her brief stay at the home for troubled teens. She encouraged others to join a class action lawsuit. By the week's end, 5 key things happened. Miller, after being questioned by the DA, worsened in health. 3 women gave detailed assault statements to the police, and the media storm forced MRE to shut down indefinitely. Jean confided in me nightly about how hard Evelyn was struggling to keep MRE afloat as salespeople left, taking clients with them. Meanwhile, CA surpassed the $24 mark, and I began selling shares in small blocks, making back our investment while still holding 2/3 of the stock. Financially, things were great. That weekend, my dad took Dean and Katie, and I returned home with a bottle of vintage Veuve Clicquot, ready to celebrate. When I arrived, I found a BMW SUV with MRE branding in the driveway. Inside, Jean was crying, and Evelyn was comforting her. I greeted them, uncorked the champagne, and poured 3 glasses. In their shock, they accepted the drinks. Jean then confronted me about the divorce papers she found, and Evelyn questioned my love for Jean. I coldly explained that I had stopped caring the moment Jean became involved with her father. I toasted to the downfall of MRE and threw my glass across the room. Evelyn, angry, seemed ready to attack, but I warned her not to try, leaving her terrified. Turning to Jean, I told her to get a lawyer and that the kids would stay with my father until custody was decided. Her shock at my behavior was evident, but I made it clear that all our recent intimacy was nothing more than me taking what I felt she owed me. I poured another drink while the two women sat speechless. Evelyn dropped her glass, spilling champagne on the rug. Jean broke hers, cutting her finger and sucking the blood. Both looked at me with fear, as if I were a madman. I sarcastically offered more champagne, knowing there would be no takers. Jean attempted to justify her actions, blaming my absence for her loneliness, but couldn't meet my eyes. I coldly replied, mocking her need for Miller. Evelyn tried to defend her father by accusing me of infidelity, but I shot back, pointing out that not all men were like her father, who preyed on vulnerable women and ruined marriages. I leaned into Evelyn, daring her to challenge me, but she knew better. I continued, condemning her father as a predator who would die a disgrace. His legacy project would fail, his money would be seized for future claims, and MRE would go bankrupt. I warned her that she would have to escape far away, carrying the shame of her father's actions and her own role in it. Evelyn was trembling and crying under my verbal attack, likely wishing she could hit me. I wished the same so I could unleash the anger I had held back for weeks. I compared her actions to Ghislaine Maxwell's role in grooming girls for Jeffrey Epstein, causing her to shake her head in fear and denial, insisting her father was a good man. I turned to Jean, giving her 2 hours to pack her things and leave. If she stayed, I threatened to call the press and expose her involvement. Furious, she cursed at me, but said she'd get a lawyer to fight for what she wanted. I repeated my warning. 2 hours. Leaving the house, the adrenaline finally hit, and I began hyperventilating, shaking uncontrollably for about 15 minutes. Once I regained control, I called my dad, instructing him to keep Dean and Katie and not let Jean be alone with them. Afterward, I drove aimlessly, eventually filling up my car and returning home late, surprised by how far I had driven. The house felt empty, like a mausoleum filled with memories of better times. I couldn't sleep, haunted by thoughts of what I had set in motion. Socrates once said that an unexamined life isn't worth living, but I avoided examining my own too deeply, especially now. It had gone too far to stop, and I worried it might unravel in court, potentially implicating me. I decided to get Layla out of town to minimize the risk. After a restless night, I called the kids, sensing Dean was already suspicious. I also reached out to Layla, who confirmed she'd leave for Chicago the next day, with $25,000 already in her account. George had arranged a job for her in property management. Later, Vicky called to tell me 3 of the women were suing Miller for damages, with papers being served Monday. We discussed how the situation had escalated, comparing it to the Harvey Weinstein case. That Saturday, I spent time with Dean and Katie, explaining that their mom and I were divorcing because of her affair with Miller. Katie cried, and Dean took it stoically. We spent the rest of the day at the driving range and had dinner together before heading home. On Sunday, I received calls from Jean's parents, asking if there was hope for reconciliation for the kids' sake, but I knew there wasn't. How can I reconcile with someone who's had an affair for years, especially with a man who's a predator? I told Jean's parents. They were shocked, unaware of the scandal in Illinois. I assured them the truth would come out in court and ended the call, hoping their image of Jean was shattered. Life moved slowly after that. Dean and Katie were back home, and my dad moved in to help. Business with George picked up, and we received glowing referrals. 2 weeks later, Vicky informed me that a 4th woman had joined the lawsuit against Miller, though, strangely, Layla hadn't. I had a meeting with Jean's lawyers to discuss the division of assets. I protected Dean and Katie's education funds and had already moved my final payouts offshore. Jean claimed we should have more cash, but I insisted it was lost in bad investments. When she called my bluff, I warned her that if she didn't accept the deal, I'd fight for the house and drain her financially. Jean alternated between anger, regret, and trying to blame me for her actions. At one point, she even suggested we try to work things out, but quickly shifted back to threatening to take me for everything. The battle dragged on for months, but I held most of the cards, fueled by righteous anger. At another meeting, when I refused to budge, Jean's lawyer threatened to get her back into the house immediately. I responded with a grin, warning Jean to tread carefully or I'd expose her complicity in a violent criminal gang. She turned pale, resembling someone in shock. "Try me," I said, "and see what happens next." As I left the office, I saw Evelyn in the foyer glaring at me. I smiled at her with the confidence of someone who had already won, and her smirk quickly faded. "You should have stayed out of it, Evelyn," I told her. "Now you'll face the consequences." 2 days later, I paid Layla another $5,000, and social media exploded with accusations that Evelyn had helped her father, Anthony Miller, recruit women for trafficking. The public outrage was swift, likening Evelyn to Ghislaine Maxwell. The DA's office faced backlash for not arresting either of them. Evelyn became a target, and the pressure mounted. Meanwhile, Miller was sued by the 4 women who had come forward. I began losing sleep, realizing that if this went to court, it could unravel everything and backfire on me. 6 weeks after my return from Singapore, I was working from home when the doorbell rang. It was Evelyn. She wanted to talk, but I wasn't in the mood to play nice. I refused at first, accusing her of trying to trap me into saying something she could use against me. She pleaded, and I eventually agreed, on the condition that she leave her phone and handbag in her car. After ensuring she wasn't recording anything, I let her in and made her sit across from me. Evelyn started by saying she thought I was a nice guy and begged me to stop what I had set in motion. She claimed the accusations against her father were lies and needed to be retracted, but I remained unmoved. I reminded her that it was now in the hands of the courts and mocked her for expecting help after her father had an affair with my wife. She was clearly defeated, tears streaming down her face as she asked when I would be satisfied. I made it clear there would be no peace until her family was completely destroyed. There was no stopping, no truce. The Millers would be utterly ruined, and that was the only outcome I sought. Evelyn realized the truth of my words but still tried one last time, offering herself to me as revenge, suggesting I make her my whore. I considered her, unmarried and recently single, fit and attractive, but instead of taking her up on the offer, I taunted her cruelly, asking if she wanted me to humiliate her in front of her father and Jean. She turned pale, called me a pig, and stormed out. I grabbed her arms, reminding her that I wasn't a predator like her father. Shaken, she fled to her car, driving off erratically. I felt both satisfaction at hurting her and disgust at my own brutality. The rest of the week was filled with meetings with lawyers and business deals. George and I were looking into promising companies on the Hong Kong and Johannesburg stock exchanges. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit against Miller gained momentum. The Millers, led by Evelyn, were trying to settle out of court while the DA hesitated to prosecute a dying man. A particularly damning revelation came from the accusers when one woman offered to describe Miller's genitals in detail, having been assaulted by him so often. This sealed the case. The Millers were financially ruined, their property sold, and the women received multi-million-dollar settlements. MRE was finished. I visited Miller in the hospital, determined to ensure he knew I was behind his downfall. I entered his room unnoticed and confronted him, telling him I had ruined his life and legacy for what he did with my wife. I asked if it was worth it, leaving him to die knowing he had lost everything. He passed away 2 days later, cremated in a small gathering attended by only 5 people, including Jean. Jean, devastated, confronted me, accusing me of ruining Miller's life. She admitted she loved him, claiming he gave her the attention she needed, unlike me, who always prioritized work and the kids. She said she had felt neglected, but I didn't let her dwell in her memories. Instead, I played a recording of my final conversation with Miller. He had confessed to using women for favors and admitted his guilt, revealing how my actions had unintentionally uncovered his predatory behavior. Miller boasted about taking Jean from me, but I reminded him it had cost him everything. Jean, overwhelmed by the truth, collapsed and went catatonic. I walked away, leaving her to deal with the consequences of her choices. She was no longer my concern. When MRE was offloading assets, I bought the house they intended for the New Horizons home at a great price. I announced through ads and radio that I would turn it into a women-run halfway house for abused women, naming it the Joy Carter Home after my mother. The home was placed in a trust, with my father, myself, and the 4 women who had sued Miller as trustees. They were eager to contribute both time and money to the project, earning praise from the media, though I kept a low profile. This move also worked in my favor during the divorce, helping me secure a deal where Jean got primary custody. I paid child support until the kids turned 18, and Jean stayed in the house while sharing the mortgage. There was no alimony. In one meeting, Jean accused me of hiding money, but I warned her off, and she backed down, clearly afraid of me. Eventually, the divorce was finalized. I bought a condo where Dean and Katie could stay on weekends since Jean worked a lot. I traveled frequently, especially to the Far East, but life wasn't too bad. Jean's relationship with Evelyn collapsed after I played the recording of Miller admitting his assaults, which I distributed widely. Evelyn disappeared after a few months, and I never heard from her again. I met Layla, whose real name was Leanne Roxton, in Chicago. She had cleaned up and was thriving at her job. When I asked her if she knew about the offense, she confirmed it was an open secret, though no one directly admitted it out of fear of being kicked out. She wasn't abused herself, but contacted others and offered them $5,000 to say they were. Rita French, one of them, ended up coming forward on her own, and from there, the Me Too movement took over. Layla reflected that she could have made more money, but by the time the lawsuit hit, she had already moved to Chicago and missed the chance. Despite this, she was grateful for the fresh start I'd given her. My revenge had unfolded better than I expected, and though I kept telling myself I wasn't a monster, I couldn't deny I had destroyed the Millers. Financially, I was doing well, and George even hinted at selling me his share of the business so he could retire. Dean and Katie had adjusted, focused on their own lives. 4 years after the divorce, Jean remarried. I remained single, struggling with trust. After some time, I began seeing a trauma counselor to heal, but I still had a long way to go.